They said he could be a great athlete, a credit to his race, as long as he remembered his place. He became an all-American football player, a warrior who dominated the gridiron in an era when other teams tried to cripple him, not just tackle him. They said he could be a brilliant scholar, a shining example of Negro potential, as long as he didn't challenge the system that educated him. He graduated as the valedictorian of his class, a genius who mastered law but found that justice was not colorblind. They said he could be a world-famous entertainer, a beloved singer with a voice like thunder and velvet, as long as his songs didn't carry the tune of revolution. He became the most celebrated and recognized black man on the entire planet. His voice, an instrument that could fill concert halls from Moscow to London. Paul Robeson was a giant in every room he ever entered. A true Renaissance man born into the suffocating confines of Jim Crow America. He was everything a nation could want in a hero. Brilliant, talented, charismatic, and powerful. And that is precisely why he was so dangerous. When he decided that his giant's strength should be used to tear down the walls of oppression, not just entertain the people who built them. When he decided that his thunderous voice should be used not just for singing spirituals, but for speaking truth to power. America decided it had to destroy him. They couldn't defeat him on the football field. They couldn't outshine him on the stage. They couldn't outwit him in an argument. So, they chose to silence him. They took away his passport, turning the entire United States into his prison. They took away his concerts, wiping his voice from the airwaves. They took away his name, erasing him from the history books. This is the story of how America declared a secret, vicious, and decades-long war on its greatest and most dangerous son. To understand the man who would one day stand up to an empire, you must first understand the bedrock of principle upon which he was built. Paul Leroy Robeson was born in Princeton, New Jersey in 1898. While he was born in the North, the shadow of the South and the institution of slavery loomed large over his existence. His father, William Drew Robeson, was a man forged in fire. Born into slavery on a plantation in North Carolina, he had escaped as a teenager, making his way north on the Underground Railroad. He was a man of immense dignity and unshakable will. He put himself through Lincoln University, became an ordained Presbyterian minister, and led a thriving congregation in Princeton. He was a patriarch in the truest sense, a man who instilled in his children three core beliefs: an absolute faith in God, a fierce and unapologetic pride in their blackness, and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. This foundation was desperately needed, for tragedy struck the Robeson family early. When Paul was just 6 years old, his mother, Maria, was tragically killed in a house fire. The loss was devastating, and it left Reverend Robeson to raise his children alone. He was a stern and demanding father, a man who expected nothing less than excellence from his sons. He taught them that in a world designed to see them as inferior, they had to be twice as good, twice as disciplined, twice as prepared. Mediocrity was not an option. Paul absorbed these lessons into his very soul. He excelled at everything he touched. He was a brilliant student, devouring books with a voracious appetite. He was a phenomenal athlete, his large, powerful frame making him a natural at football and basketball. And he possessed a voice, a deep, resonant bass baritone that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. In 1915, Paul Robeson won a statewide academic scholarship to Rutgers College, which would later become Rutgers University. It was a monumental achievement. He was only the third black student to ever enroll at the institution. But his acceptance was not a welcome. It was a challenge. From the first day he stepped on campus, he was an island in a sea of white faces, a target for the casual and organized racism of the era. Nowhere was this more brutal than on the football field. When he tried out for the varsity football team, the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, the decision was met with open hostility by some of his white teammates. They did not see him as a teammate. They saw him as an intruder. During one of the first scrimmages, he was deliberately and viciously targeted. The players piled on him, stomping on his hands, twisting his body. A cleat came down on his hand, tearing his fingernails out by the roots. He was left a broken, bleeding mess on the field. The coach, Foster Sanford, walked over to the injured boy and asked him bluntly, "What are you going to do?" It was a test. Would he break? Would he quit? Robeson was carried off the field, but he did not quit. Fueled by his father's lessons on enduring with dignity, he returned to practice. As he lined up for the next scrimmage, he told his teammates, in a voice that was both calm and terrifyingly intense, "You've done all you can do to me. Now I'm going to play football." What followed was a display of athletic dominance that became a legend at the university. He was an unstoppable force on the field, a giant of a man who played with a controlled, intelligent fury. He became the emotional and physical heart of the team. He was named an All-American in both 1917 and 1918, a rare honor that placed him in the absolute top echelon of college football players in the entire country. Walter Camp, the father of American football, would later call him the greatest defensive end that ever played the game. But his triumphs were not confined to the gridiron. He was also a giant in the classroom. He won oratorical contests every year he was eligible. He was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, the nation's most prestigious academic honor society. And in 1919, upon his graduation, he was chosen by the faculty as the class valedictorian, the single student who best represented the ideals of the university. Imagine the scene. A young black man, the son of a runaway slave, standing before an all-white audience of his peers, their parents, and the university faculty to deliver the farewell address. His speech, titled "The New Idealism," was a powerful and prophetic call for a world where all people, regardless of race or creed, could live in equality and peace. He was a living, breathing refutation of every racist stereotype. He was not just the equal of his white classmates. He had proven himself to be their superior in both body and mind. He had conquered Rutgers. Now he set his sights on conquering the world beyond. The foundation had been laid for the man who would one day be seen as both a national treasure and a national threat. Armed with a degree from Rutgers and the armor of an all-American athlete, Paul Robeson stepped into the world, determined to carve out a place for himself in a nation that was still deeply uncomfortable with his very existence. He initially followed the path of professional ambition, enrolling at the prestigious New York University School of Law. To support himself, he played professional football on the weekends, a bruising semi-organized sport in the days before the modern NFL. He played for teams like the Akron Pros and the Milwaukee Badgers, earning a reputation as one of the most dominant and feared players in the fledgling league. But football was just a means to an end. His true goal was to use his intellect to fight for his people in the courtroom. He transferred to Columbia Law School, an Ivy League institution, and graduated in 1923. He was a brilliant legal mind, and he quickly secured a position at a prestigious New York law firm. This was the dream his father had envisioned, a professional, respected black man making his way in the white world. But the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The reality of being a black lawyer in a white firm in the 1920s was a constant soul-crushing exercise in humiliation. While he was praised for his legal research, the firm's partners were terrified of putting him in front of a white client. The breaking point came when a white secretary refused to take dictation from him, stating bluntly, "I don't take dictation from a nigger." In that moment, Robeson had a profound and life-altering realization. It didn't matter that he was a brilliant lawyer. It didn't matter that he was a celebrated athlete. To this secretary, and to the system she represented, he was still just a color. He understood that the law, the very institution he had hoped to use as a tool for justice, was itself infected with the disease of racism. He walked out of that law firm and never looked back. The path of traditional professional success, he realized, was a dead end, a gilded cage. He needed to find a different kind of power, a different kind of voice. He found it on the stage. While he was still in law school, his wife, the brilliant and ambitious Eslanda Essie Good, had urged him to try acting. She saw in him a natural charisma, a commanding presence, and a voice that could shake the foundations of a theater. He began to take small roles in plays in Harlem and in the experimental theaters of Greenwich Village, and almost immediately it was clear that he had found his true calling. His breakthrough came in the plays of Eugene O'Neill, America's most important and controversial playwright. O'Neill was one of the few white artists who was attempting to write serious, complex roles for black actors. In 1924, Robeson starred in O'Neill's All God's Chillin' Got Wings, a play about an interracial marriage. The very subject matter was so explosive that the Ku Klux Klan threatened to bomb the theater. The play opened to a storm of controversy, but Robeson's performance was hailed as a revelation. He brought a depth, a dignity, and a raw emotional power to the role that was unlike anything the American stage had ever seen. That same year, he starred in a revival of O'Neill's The Emperor Jones, playing the role of Brutus Jones, a Pullman porter who becomes the despotic ruler of a Caribbean island. The role was physically and emotionally grueling, a one-man tour de force. Robeson's performance was a sensation. His booming, resonant voice, his powerful physique, and his ability to convey both immense pride and terrifying psychological collapse captivated audiences and critics alike. He was no longer just a former football player. He was a serious and perhaps even great actor. But it was his voice, his singing voice, that would make him a global superstar. He had grown up singing the spirituals of the Black church, songs that were the bedrock of his father's faith. He began to incorporate these songs into his performances, not as folk curiosities, but as profound works of art. In 1925, he gave his first professional concert, a program composed entirely of African American spirituals. It was a revolutionary act. He was taking the music that had been born in the crucible of slavery and placing it on the concert stage, treating it with the same reverence and artistic seriousness as a German lieder or an Italian aria. The effect was mesmerizing. His voice was an instrument of almost supernatural power and beauty. It was a true bass baritone, a voice that could be as gentle as a prayer and as powerful as a thunderstorm. When he sang a song like Go Down Moses or Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, he wasn't just singing notes. He was channeling the collective pain, sorrow, and unshakable faith of generations of his people. The concerts were a massive success. He began to tour, not just in America, but around the world. He moved to London in the late 1920s, and it was there that he became a true international icon. Europe, which did not have America's deep-seated and violent racial pathologies, embraced him in a way his home country never could. He became one of the most famous and beloved figures in the world. He starred in the London production of the musical Showboat, where his rendition of Old Man River became his signature song, an anthem of black endurance that would be forever associated with his voice. He played Othello on the London stage in 1930, a groundbreaking performance that shattered racial barriers and established him as one of the great Shakespearean actors of his generation. He starred in a series of British films, becoming one of the first black movie stars. He was more than just an entertainer. He was a cultural ambassador, a symbol of black genius and dignity to a global audience. He was handsome, intelligent, articulate, and possessed a charisma that was almost hypnotic. He was living a life of incredible glamour and success. He was a wealthy, celebrated artist who was welcomed in the highest circles of European society. He had achieved a level of fame and acceptance that was simply unimaginable for any other black person of his time. He was a king, living in a self-imposed, but glorious exile. He had conquered the world of art. But his travels, and the people he met along the way, were about to awaken a new and more dangerous ambition within him, the desire to change the world, not just sing to it. Paul Robeson's time in Europe was more than just an artistic triumph. It was a profound political and intellectual awakening. In the vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere of London and Paris, he was exposed to a world of ideas and a spectrum of political thought that had been largely inaccessible to him in the racially segregated bubble of America. He began to see the struggle of Black Americans not as an isolated problem, but as part of a larger, global pattern of oppression and exploitation. He was no longer just an artist. He was becoming a student of the world. He befriended a group of young, anti-colonial African intellectuals, men like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, who would one day become the founding fathers of their newly independent nations. In their passionate conversations in London cafes, they shared stories of colonial brutality and dreams of liberation. Robeson began to see the direct line that connected the lynchings in Georgia to the British Empire's exploitation of Africa. He was developing a global, pan-African consciousness, a sense that the fight for Black dignity was a worldwide struggle. But the most transformative experience of his life, the journey that would fundamentally alter his worldview and set him on a collision course with the American government, was his visit to the Soviet Union in 1934. He was invited to Moscow as a celebrated artist, and what he found there stunned him. For the first time in his life, he was in a country where he felt the weight of his skin completely and totally disappear. He was not a Negro artist. He was just an artist. He was not a Black man. He was just a man. He was treated with a level of respect and an absence of racial consciousness that was to him a revelation. He could walk into any restaurant, stay in any hotel, and be greeted not with suspicion or contempt, but with warmth and admiration. He later described the feeling with a sense of profound wonder. "Here," he said, "I am not a Negro, but a human being. I walk in full human dignity." In the Soviet Union, he saw a society that was officially, and in his experience, actually colorblind. The government's official anti-racist ideology, its celebration of the equality of all peoples, seemed to him to be a beautiful and powerful reality. He was deeply moved. He began to study Russian, and he saw in the Soviet experiment, with its promise of a classless, egalitarian society, a powerful antidote to the poisons of racism and capitalism that he believed were at the root of so much of the world's suffering. His embrace of the Soviet Union was not naive, but it was deeply idealistic. He was seeing the country through the eyes of a man who had known the brutal realities of American racism his entire life. To him, any system that declared racism to be a crime was a system worth admiring. He was not blind to the system's flaws, but he saw them as the growing pains of a new and better world being born. This affinity for the Soviet Union, this belief in the ideals of socialism, would become the single most dangerous and controversial aspect of his public life. To an America that was becoming increasingly defined by its anti-communist ideology, Robeson's views were not just radical, they were treasonous. His political consciousness, now fully awakened, found a new and urgent cause in the mid-1930s with the rise of fascism in Europe. He saw in Hitler's Nazism and Mussolini's fascism the same ideologies of racial supremacy and violent oppression that he had fought his entire life, just on a global and more monstrous scale. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, a battle between the democratically elected Republican government and the fascist forces of General Francisco Franco, Robeson knew he could not remain silent. He saw it as the first great battle in the coming world war against fascism. He became one of the most prominent and passionate international voices in support of the Spanish Republic. He gave benefit concerts across the world, raising thousands of dollars for the anti-fascist cause. But he didn't just sing from a safe distance. In 1938, he traveled to Spain, to the front lines of the war. He went to the trenches to be with the soldiers of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the group of American volunteers who had come to Spain to fight against Franco. Imagine the scene. This world-famous, millionaire entertainer, a man who could have been safe in his London mansion, was now standing in a muddy trench, surrounded by exhausted, battle-weary soldiers. And he sang to them. He sang the spirituals of his people, songs of struggle and of hope. He sang Old Man River, his voice a thunderous, defiant roar that echoed across the battlefield. For the soldiers, many of whom were facing almost certain death, the presence of this giant, this global icon, was an incredible source of inspiration. It was a statement that the world was watching, that their fight was not in vain. Robeson was no longer just an artist. He was a comrade, a brother in arms in the global fight against tyranny. When he returned from Spain, he was a changed man. He was no longer just a performer who happened to have political views. He was a revolutionary who used his art as a weapon. He began to see his concerts not as entertainment, but as political rallies. He would speak from the stage, connecting the plight of the Spanish Republicans to the plight of the sharecroppers in Mississippi, connecting the fight against Hitler to the fight against the KKK. He declared that the artist could not be neutral, that in a world of injustice, to be silent was to be complicit. He had reached a point of no return. He had become too loud, too powerful, too uncompromising for the American establishment to tolerate. He was a giant, in talent, in intellect, and now in political conviction. He was the most famous and beloved black man on the planet, and he was using that fame to call for a radical transformation of the world. He was a hero to the oppressed everywhere, and in the eyes of the powerful in his own country, that made him the most dangerous man in America. The stage was being set for a final, brutal confrontation. The giant had chosen his side, and the empire was about to strike back. As World War II gave way to the icy paranoia of the Cold War, the America that Paul Robeson returned to was a nation consumed by a new and terrifying hysteria. The fight against fascism abroad was replaced by a rabid, all-consuming hunt for communists at home. It was the era of McCarthyism, a time of blacklists, loyalty oaths, and public show trials, where careers were destroyed and lives were ruined by accusation and innuendo. And in this new, paranoid landscape, Paul Robeson, the world-famous artist and outspoken leftist, was no longer just a controversial figure. He was public enemy number one. His open admiration for the Soviet Union, his support for labor unions, and his relentless criticism of American racism made him the perfect target. The FBI, under the personal and obsessive direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had already been monitoring him for years. They had amassed a file on him that was thousands of pages long, detailing his every speech, his every association, his every movement. But now, in the new climate of the Cold War, this secret surveillance escalated into an open and declared war. The goal was not just to monitor him, but to silence him, to destroy him, to make him an example to any other black leader who dared to step out of line. The campaign was systematic and brutal. Concert halls across the country were pressured by government agents and right-wing groups to cancel his performances. Mayors and city councils declared him a security risk and refused to allow him to perform in their cities. The right-wing press ran a relentless smear campaign, painting him as a traitor, a puppet of Moscow, a man who had turned his back on his own country. His record labels, terrified of being associated with him, dropped him. His records were pulled from the shelves of stores and removed from the playlists of radio stations. His films were banned from being shown in theaters. In a few short years, the most famous and beloved black entertainer in the world was being systematically erased from American public life. He was being made a ghost, a non-person. The financial and psychological toll was immense. His income, which had once been hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, dwindled to almost nothing. He was forced to sell his beautiful home in Connecticut. Friends and colleagues, terrified of being caught in the net of the blacklist, began to shun him. He was becoming an outcast, isolated and embattled. The culmination of this campaign came in a series of dramatic, public confrontations. In 1949, at a concert in Peekskill, New York, the same event where Eugene Bullard was beaten, a violent, racist, and anti-communist mob attacked the concertgoers with rocks and bats while the police stood by and did nothing. It was a terrifying display of the violent hatred that had been unleashed against him. But his most famous and defiant stand came in 1956, when he was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, SHU-AC, the infamous congressional body that had become the public face of the McCarthy-era witch hunts. The hearing was a show trial, a piece of political theater designed to publicly humiliate and discredit him. They did not ask him if he was a member of the Communist Party. That was not the point. They wanted him to denounce his political beliefs, to name the names of his associates, to perform a ritual of public penance. Paul Robeson refused to play their game. He walked into that hearing room not as a frightened witness, but as a giant. He did not plead the Fifth Amendment. He confronted them directly. When a congressman asked him why he, a man who had achieved so much success, was so critical of America, Robeson's voice boomed through the chamber. "Because my father was a slave," he thundered, "and I consider it my responsibility to my people that I shall continue to fight and even die for their rights." When they pressed him on his affinity for the Soviet Union, he turned the tables on them, comparing the racism of the American South to the horrors of Nazism, and declaring that it was they, the segregationist politicians, who were the truly un-American ones. But his most legendary and defiant moment came when a congressman, trying to bait him, asked, "Why don't you stay in Russia?" Robeson leaned into the microphone, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fury. "Because my father was a slave," he repeated, "and my people died to build this country, and I am going to stay here and have a piece of it just like you. And no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?" The room was stunned into silence. He had refused to be their victim. He had used their own stage to put them and the entire system of American racism on trial. The government, furious at his defiance and unable to silence his voice at home, decided to take the most drastic and punitive step of all. In 1950, the State Department revoked his passport. It was an act of almost unimaginable cruelty and a flagrant violation of his basic human rights. Paul Robeson, one of the most celebrated and beloved international figures in the world, was now a prisoner in his own country. He could not travel. He could not perform for the global audiences that still adored him. He was cut off from his international career, from a huge source of his income, and from the world stage where his voice had been so powerful. The United States government had turned the entire country into his jail cell. For 8 long years, from 1950 to 1958, he was trapped. He could not accept the lucrative offers to perform in London, Paris, or Moscow. He could not attend international peace conferences or speak to the anti-colonial movements he had inspired. The giant was in a cage. He continued to fight, of course. He sang at small churches and union halls to the audiences that would still have him. He recorded his own newsletter, Freedom, to get his voice out. But the damage was done. His career had been destroyed. His voice had been, for the most part, silenced. The government had succeeded. They had taken the most famous black man in the world and had made him invisible. It was a victory for the Cold War and a profound, shameful loss for the cause of freedom and for America itself. The 8 years that Paul Robeson spent without a passport were a long, slow, and grinding form of psychological warfare. The government's strategy was clear. If they could not break his spirit, they would break his connection to the world, and in doing so, break his career and his influence. He was a global figure trapped on a national island, a singer whose voice could fill the grandest concert halls, but was now confined to the small churches and union meetings that dared to host him. It was a period of immense financial hardship and profound creative frustration, but it was also a period of unwavering, dignified resistance. Robeson refused to be silenced. He fought his travel ban in the courts, a long and arduous legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And he found creative, audacious ways to project his voice beyond the prison walls of America. In one famous and deeply moving event, he held a concert on the U.S.-Canada border. He stood on a flatbed truck on the American side in a peace park in Washington state and sang to an audience of over 30,000 people who had gathered on the Canadian side to hear him. His voice, that powerful, resonant bass baritone, rolled across the border, a living symbol of a spirit that refused to be contained by arbitrary lines on a map. He also made a historic recording of a concert over the telephone. An audience had gathered in London, and Robeson, from a studio in New York, sang to them over the transatlantic cable. The sound quality was poor, a ghostly echo of his true power, but the message was thunderously clear. You can take my passport, but you cannot take my voice. Finally, in 1958, after a landmark Supreme Court ruling that declared the State Department's travel ban to be unconstitutional, Robeson won. His passport was returned. After 8 long years, the cage was unlocked. He was 60 years old, but he was free to travel again. He immediately embarked on a triumphant international tour, a resurrection of his global career. He was greeted in London, Moscow, and across Europe not as a controversial figure, but as a returning hero, a martyr who had survived the crucible of McCarthyism. The concerts were sold out. The ovations were thunderous. It seemed as though the giant was back. But the long years of battle had taken a terrible and irreversible toll. The constant stress, the financial strain, the psychological weight of being a public enemy in his own country, it had all worn him down. His physical health began to decline. And more tragically, he began to suffer from severe bouts of depression and paranoia. In 1961, while in Moscow, he experienced a profound mental breakdown. There are still many unanswered and controversial questions surrounding this event, with some of his supporters believing he was targeted and drugged by the CIA, a final, insidious act of political warfare. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The unbreakable giant was broken. He returned to America not as a triumphant artist, but as a patient. He spent the next several years in and out of hospitals, undergoing treatment that was often as brutal as the illness itself. The fire that had burned so brightly, that had challenged an empire, was being extinguished by a quiet, internal darkness. In the mid-1960s, at the very height of the civil rights movement he had helped to inspire, Paul Robeson made a decision. He retired. Completely. He withdrew from public life, from the political battles he had waged for so long. He moved into his sister's home in Philadelphia and spent the final decade of his life in a self-imposed, almost monastic silence. He issued no statements. He gave no interviews. The man who had been one of the most famous and outspoken figures in the world chose to end his life in quiet obscurity. It was a tragic and poignant end to an epic life. While a new generation of activists marched on Washington and fought for the very rights he had championed a generation earlier, the old warrior was silent. He had fought his battles too early, had been too far ahead of his time, and he had paid a terrible price for his prophetic vision. When he died in 1976, his passing was noted, but the true, radical, and uncomfortable story of his life was still largely a taboo subject in mainstream America. The process of forgetting, which the government had started in the 1950s, had been largely successful, but a legacy this monumental cannot be buried forever. In the decades following his death, as the passions of the Cold War faded and a new generation of scholars and artists began to re-examine the past, his story began to be rediscovered. They saw him not as the traitor he had been painted as, but as a man of profound and unwavering principle, a hero who had sacrificed everything for his beliefs. His recordings were reissued. His films were restored. His name was restored to the college football record books. He was given a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award posthumously, and the uncomfortable truths he had spoken about racism, colonialism, and economic injustice began to sound less like radical propaganda and more like prophecy. So what is the final, enduring lesson of Paul Robeson's magnificent and tragic life? It is a story about the immense power and the immense cost of a single, uncompromising voice. He was a man who was given a choice. He could have been a beloved and wealthy entertainer, a safe black celebrity who smiled and sang and never rocked the boat. America would have adored him for it. But he chose a different path. He chose to use his platform, his fame, his giant's voice to fight for the oppressed, not just in America, but around the world. He believed that the artist could not be separate from the struggle, that his voice belonged not to him, but to the people. They said he could be a great athlete, a great scholar, a great artist. He achieved all of that, and then he told them it was not enough. He demanded to be a great man, a full citizen of the world, and he demanded that same right for all people. For this, America, the country his people had died to build, tried to destroy him. They took his passport. They took his career. They tried to take his name, but they could not take his truth. The story of Paul Robeson is a testament to the fact that you can silence a man, but you cannot silence an idea. He was a giant, not just in stature, but in courage. And his spirit, the spirit of the artist as a warrior for justice, continues to march on. After turning his back on the hollow promise of a legal career, Paul Robeson found himself at the epicenter
A moment when
of a
Black
cultural
America,
earthquake.
particularly in the
He
cultural
stepped
capital
from
of
the
Harlem,
sterile,
was
racist
defining
confines
itself
of a Wall
on its
Street
own
law
terms.
firm into the vibrant,
For the first
chaotic,
time on a
and
grand scale,
revolutionary world
Black writers,
of the Harlem
poets,
Renaissance.
musicians, and
This
thinkers
was more
were
than
creating
just an
art
artistic
that was
movement. It was a
unapologetically,
declaration
powerfully,
of
and
independence.
beautifully black. And Paul Robeson, with his immense talent and commanding presence, was about to become its biggest star. His journey into this world was guided by his wife, Eslanda Essie Good, a brilliant and ambitious woman who was, in many ways, the architect of his early career. Essie was a trained chemist, a graduate of Columbia University, but she possessed a savvy and strategic mind for the world of arts and public relations. She saw in her husband not just a man with a beautiful voice, but a potential icon, a symbol of black genius that could shatter the racist caricatures that dominated American popular culture. It was she who pushed him to take his first acting roles, who managed his schedule, and who helped to craft his public image as a dignified and powerful artist. His breakthrough in the plays of Eugene O'Neill was a pivotal moment. O'Neill's The Emperor Jones and All God's Chillin' Got Wings were not perfect plays. They were still written from a white perspective and were often filled with the racial anxieties of their time. But they were a radical departure from the minstrelsy and Uncle Tom roles that had been the only options for black actors. O'Neill was grappling, however imperfectly, with the psychological depth and complexity of the black experience. For Robeson, this was a revelation. He was being asked not just to perform, but to act, to inhabit a character, to explore the full range of human emotion. His performance as Brutus Jones in The Emperor Jones was a tour de force that left audiences breathless. The play is essentially a 90-minute monologue, tracing the psychological collapse of a black man who has made himself a tyrant. Robeson was on stage alone for most of the play, his character hunted not just by his rebellious subjects, but by the ghosts of his own past. His performance was primal, terrifying, and deeply human. He used his powerful physique and his thunderous voice to convey a sense of immense, tragic grandeur. The white critics were stunned. They had never seen a black actor command a stage with such power and authority. They were forced to acknowledge him not as a Negro performer, but as one of the great actors of his generation. But even as he was being celebrated, Robeson was acutely aware of the contradictions of his position. He was a black artist succeeding in a white world, on a white stage, in plays written by a white man. He was becoming famous, but was he truly free? This question began to haunt him. It was his music, the music of his people, that offered him a path to a more authentic form of expression. When he gave his first concert of all Negro spirituals in 1925, it was a political act as much as an artistic one. The spirituals, songs born in the crucible of slavery, had long been seen by the white establishment as a kind of primitive, unrefined folk music. Robeson, with his formal concert training and his magnificent, classically trained voice, elevated them. He presented them as high art, as America's own classical tradition, a body of music as profound and as complex as the works of Bach or Beethoven. He was, in effect, re-educating his audiences, forcing them to confront the deep, tragic, and beautiful history that these songs contained. When his voice filled a concert hall with the sorrowful plea of "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child," he was not just singing a song, he was channeling the collective soul of a people, and the effect was mesmerizing. This artistic mission led him to London in the late 1920s, and it was there that his political consciousness truly began to flower. Europe, and particularly the intellectual and artistic circles of London, provided him with a new lens through which to view his own experience. He discovered the works of Karl Marx and became fascinated with socialist theory, seeing in its critique of class exploitation a powerful tool for understanding the economic roots of racism. He became a student of African history and linguistics, immersing himself in the cultures of a continent that American education had taught him to see as dark and primitive. This intellectual journey was inseparable from his artistic one. He began to see his role as an artist not just to entertain, but to build bridges, to use his platform to showcase the dignity and the shared humanity of all peoples. He learned dozens of languages: Russian, Chinese, German, Spanish, and several African languages, and he began to incorporate the folk songs of these cultures into his concerts. A Paul Robeson concert became a global event, a journey through the music of the world's working and oppressed peoples. He would sing a Negro spiritual, followed by a Welsh mining song, a Russian folk anthem, and a Chinese revolutionary tune. His message was clear: the struggles of a sharecropper in Mississippi, a coal miner in Wales, and a peasant in China were all connected. They were all part of the same human family, fighting for the same basic rights to dignity and freedom. This was a radical and dangerous idea. In a world that was being torn apart by nationalism and racial ideology, Robeson was preaching a message of universal humanism. And he was not just singing about it, he was living it. His friendships with anti-colonial African leaders, his travels to the Soviet Union, his outspoken support for labor movements, it was all part of a cohesive worldview. The giant was no longer just an artist. He was becoming a global citizen, a man whose stage was the entire world, and whose cause was the liberation of all humanity. America had given him fame, but the world was giving him a purpose, and that purpose would lead him into a direct and brutal confrontation with the very country that had made him a star. The intellectual and political seeds that were planted in the fertile ground of London's leftist circles came to full, revolutionary flower during Paul Robeson's first visit to the Soviet Union in 1934. This journey was not just a concert tour, it was a pilgrimage, a journey to a land that he had been told was a real-world embodiment of the racial equality he had dreamed of his entire life. The invitation came from the great Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein, who wanted Robeson to star in a film about the Haitian Revolution. Though the film was never made, the trip itself would fundamentally and irrevocably alter the course of Robeson's life. From the moment he stepped off the train in Moscow, he was plunged into a world that, to him, felt like a waking dream. For the first time in his 36 years, he was in a country where he felt the crushing weight of his skin completely and totally disappear. He was not a Negro artist to be celebrated as an exotic exception. He was simply Paul Robeson, a world-renowned artist. He was not a black man to be watched with suspicion or patronized with condescension. He was just a man. He was greeted not with the familiar, veiled racism of the American North or the open hostility of the South, but with a warmth, an admiration, and a profound sense of human comradeship that stunned him. He later described the experience with a sense of almost spiritual wonder. "Here," he said, "for the first time in my life, I walk in full human dignity." It was the simple, everyday things that struck him the most. He could walk into any restaurant, stay in any hotel, and be treated not just as an equal, but as an honored guest. He saw children of different races playing together in the parks, their interactions free of the poison of racial consciousness that defined American life. He saw in the Soviet Union's official, state-sponsored anti-racism a powerful and beautiful reality. The government's constitution explicitly declared racism to be a crime, a concept that was almost laughably utopian from an American perspective. He was deeply moved by this. He began to study Russian, a language he would master, and he became fascinated with the works of Russian writers and composers like Pushkin and Mussorgsky. He saw in the Soviet experiment, with its promise of a classless, egalitarian society, a powerful antidote to the twin poisons of racism and capitalism that he had come to believe were inextricably linked. He saw a nation that was attempting, however imperfectly, to build a new world, a world free from the exploitation and bigotry that had defined his own experience. His embrace of the Soviet Union was not entirely naive, but it was profoundly idealistic. He was seeing the country through the eyes of a man who had known the brutal, soul-crushing realities of American racism his entire life. To him, any system, any government that declared racism to be a fundamental evil and a punishable crime was a system worth admiring and defending. He was aware of the political repressions, of the dark side of Stalin's rule, but he saw these as the unfortunate, but perhaps necessary growing pains of a new and better world struggling to be born. He chose to focus on the ideal, on the promise of a society that was actively fighting against the very hatred that had almost led to his father's lynching. This affinity for the Soviet Union, this belief in the fundamental righteousness of its anti-racist and anti-colonial stance, would become the single most dangerous and controversial aspect of his public life. To an America that was becoming increasingly defined by its rabid anti-communist ideology, Robeson's views were not just radical. They were seen as a profound and unforgivable betrayal. This newly solidified political consciousness, this global perspective on the struggle for human dignity, found a new and urgent cause in the mid-1930s with the rise of fascism in Europe. He saw in Hitler's Nazism and Mussolini's fascism the same ideologies of racial supremacy and violent oppression that he had fought his entire life, just amplified to a global and more monstrous scale. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, a brutal conflict between the democratically elected Republican government and the fascist forces of General Francisco Franco, backed by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, Robeson knew he could not remain on the sidelines. He saw it correctly as the first great battle in the coming world war against fascism. He threw himself into the cause with a passion and a fury that was born of his newfound political conviction. He became one of the most prominent and powerful international voices in support of the Spanish Republic. He gave benefit concerts across the world, from London's Royal Albert Hall to the packed arenas of America, raising thousands of dollars to buy ambulances and supplies for the anti-fascist cause. He used his celebrity as a weapon, his voice a clarion call to awaken the world to the danger of a rising fascist tide. But he didn't just sing from the safety of a distant stage. In 1938, he made the perilous journey to Spain itself, to the front lines of the war. He went to the trenches to be with the soldiers of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the brave and idealistic group of American volunteers who had defied their own government's neutrality to come and fight against Franco. Imagine the scene. Paul Robeson, the world-famous millionaire entertainer, a man who could have been safe and comfortable in his London mansion, was now standing in a muddy, shell-pocked trench surrounded by exhausted, battle-weary soldiers. And he sang to them. He didn't have an orchestra. It was just his voice, that magnificent, thunderous bass baritone, echoing across the battlefield. He sang the spirituals of his people, songs of struggle, of sorrow, and of unshakable hope. He sang Ol' Man River, his voice a defiant roar of endurance in the face of tyranny. For the soldiers, many of whom were facing almost certain death in a brutal, grinding war, the presence of this giant, this global icon who had risked his life to be with them, was an incredible source of inspiration. It was a powerful statement that the world was watching, that their sacrifice was not in vain. Robeson was no longer just an artist. He was a comrade, a brother in arms in the global fight against tyranny. When he returned from Spain, he was a changed man, fully and completely radicalized. He was no longer just a performer who happened to have political views. He was a revolutionary who used his art as his primary weapon. When Paul Robeson returned to America in the late 1930s, he was a man transformed. His experiences in the Soviet Union and on the battlefields of Spain had solidified his worldview. He was no longer just a critic of American racism. He was a fierce and uncompromising opponent of what he saw as the interconnected global systems of colonialism, capitalism, and fascism. He began to see his role as an artist not merely to entertain, but to serve as a voice for the voiceless, a warrior for the oppressed everywhere. He declared, in a famous and defiant statement, "The artist must elect to fight for freedom or for slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative." This was a radical and dangerous declaration. As America emerged from World War II, it was not into an era of global unity, but into the icy paranoia of the Cold War. The fight against fascism abroad was immediately replaced by a rabid, all-consuming hunt for communists at home. It was the dawn of the McCarthy era, a time of blacklists, loyalty oaths, and public show trials, where careers were destroyed and lives were ruined by accusation and innuendo. And in this new, paranoid landscape, Paul Robeson, the world-famous artist and outspoken leftist, was no longer just a controversial figure. He was deemed a threat to national security, public enemy number one. His open admiration for the Soviet Union, his unwavering support for labor unions, and his relentless, powerful criticism of American racism and its foreign policy made him the perfect target. The FBI, under the personal and obsessive direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had already been monitoring him for years, amassing a file on him that was thousands of pages long, detailing his every speech, his every association, his every movement. But now, in the new climate of the Cold War, this secret surveillance escalated into an open and declared war. The goal was no longer just to monitor him, but to silence him, to destroy his career, to crush his influence, and to make him a terrifying example to any other black leader who dared to step so far out of line. The campaign was systematic, vicious, and brutally effective. Concert halls across the country were visited by FBI agents and pressured by right-wing groups like the American Legion to cancel his performances. Mayors and city councils, bowing to political pressure, declared him a security risk, and refused to allow him to perform in their cities. The right-wing press, led by powerful columnists like Westbrook Pegler, ran a relentless and deeply personal smear campaign, painting him as a traitor, a puppet of Moscow, a man who had turned his back on the very country that had given him his fame. His record labels, terrified of being associated with a subversive, dropped him. His records were pulled from the shelves of stores and removed from the playlists of radio stations. His films were banned from being shown in theaters. In a few short, shocking years, the most famous and beloved black entertainer in the world was being systematically and deliberately erased from American public life. He was being made a ghost, a non-person. The financial and psychological toll was immense. His income, which had once been hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, dwindled to almost nothing. He was forced to sell his beautiful home in Connecticut. Friends and colleagues, terrified of being caught in the net of the Hollywood blacklist, began to shun him. He was becoming an outcast, isolated and embattled. The culmination of this campaign of hate came in a series of dramatic, violent, and public confrontations. In the summer of 1949, a concert was planned in Peekskill, New York, to benefit a civil rights organization. When Robeson was announced as the headline performer, the local community erupted in a frenzy of anti-communist and racist hysteria. The first concert attempt was attacked by a mob before it even began. They burned a cross on a nearby hill, dragged people from their cars, and beat them with bats, while the police stood by and did little. But Robeson refused to be intimidated. He and the organizers rescheduled the concert for a week later. This time, thousands of supporters, many of them trade union members who acted as a volunteer security force, formed a human shield around the concert grounds. Robeson performed, his voice a thunderous and defiant roar in the face of the hatred that surrounded him. But as the concertgoers tried to leave, they were ambushed. The roads were lined with a mob of thousands, armed with rocks, bricks, and bats. They smashed car windows, overturned vehicles, and dragged people out to be beaten. It was a full-blown, terrifying riot, a display of raw, unhinged violence. And again, the police were largely complicit, doing little to stop the attackers. Paul Robeson, the giant, had to be smuggled out, hidden on the floor of a car, to escape the mob that was screaming for his blood. But his most famous and defiant stand came not in a field, but in a hearing room. In 1956, he was subpoenaed to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAS, the infamous congressional body that had become the public face of the McCarthy-era witch hunts. The hearing was a show trial, a piece of political theater designed to publicly humiliate and discredit him. They did not truly care if he was a member of the Communist Party. That was not the point. They wanted him to denounce his political beliefs, to name the names of his associates, to perform a ritual of public penance, and grovel for their forgiveness. Paul Robeson refused to play their game. He walked into that hearing room not as a frightened witness, but as a king entering a court of jesters. He did not plead the Fifth Amendment. He confronted them directly, using their own stage to put them and the entire system of American racism on trial. When a congressman asked him why he, a man who had achieved so much success in America, was so critical of his country, Robeson's voice boomed through the chamber. "Because my father was a slave," he thundered, "and I consider it my responsibility to my people, that I shall continue to fight and even die for their rights." When they pressed him on his affinity for the Soviet Union, he turned the tables on them, comparing the racism of the American South to the very fascism they claimed to oppose. And in his most legendary and defiant moment, when a congressman trying to bait him asked contemptuously, "Why don't you stay in Russia?" Robeson leaned into the microphone, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fury. "Because my father was a slave," he repeated, his voice a low and dangerous growl, "and my people died to build this country. and I am going to stay here and have a piece of it just like you. And no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?" The room was stunned into silence. He had refused to be their victim. He had met their power with a greater power of his own. The giant had roared. The government, furious at Paul Robeson's magnificent defiance before HUAC and unable to silence his powerful voice at home, decided to deploy its most drastic and punitive weapon. If they could not break his will, they would break his connection to the world. In 1950, in an act of almost unimaginable cruelty and a flagrant violation of his basic human rights as an American citizen, the U.S. State Department revoked his passport. Paul Robeson, one of the most celebrated and beloved international figures on the planet, was now a prisoner in his own country. The bars of his cage were the very borders of the United States. For 8 long and grinding years, from 1950 to 1958, the giant was trapped. He could not travel. He could not accept the lucrative and prestigious offers to perform in the grand concert halls of London, Paris, or Moscow that still poured in. He could not attend the international peace conferences where his voice and presence were desperately wanted. He could not speak to the anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia that he had helped to inspire. He was cut off from his international career, from the vast global audience that still adored him, and from the world stage where his voice had been such a powerful force for change. The United States government had turned the entire country into his jail cell, a vast and lonely island. This was a calculated strategy of strangulation. By severing his connection to the world, they also severed his primary source of income. His earnings plummeted by over 90%. The man who had been a millionaire, who had lived a life of international glamour, was now struggling to pay his bills. But the goal was more than just financial ruin. The goal was psychological warfare. They wanted to isolate him, to make him feel powerless, to break his spirit through a slow, grinding war of attrition. They wanted to make him an example, a cautionary tale to any other artist or activist who dared to challenge the status quo. But Robeson refused to be broken. He fought back with the tools he had left. He waged a long and arduous legal battle against the travel ban, a fight for a principle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. He argued, correctly, that the right to travel was a fundamental human right, not a privilege to be granted or denied based on a citizen's political beliefs. And he found creative, audacious ways to project his voice beyond the prison walls of America. In one famous and deeply moving event in 1952, he held a concert on the U.S.-Canada border. He stood on a flatbed truck on the American side in a peace park in Washington state and sang to an audience of over 30,000 people who had gathered on the Canadian side to hear him. His voice, that powerful, resonant bass baritone, rolled across the border, a living symbol of a spirit that refused to be contained by arbitrary lines on a map. He also made a historic recording of a concert over the telephone. An audience had gathered in London, and Robeson, from a studio in New York, sang to them over the newly laid transatlantic cable. The sound quality was poor, a ghostly, distorted echo of his true power, but the message was thunderously clear. "You can take my passport, but you cannot take my voice." Finally, in 1958, after a landmark Supreme Court ruling in a related case affirmed that the State Department did not have the authority to deny passports based on political beliefs, Robeson won. His passport was returned. After 8 long years of internal exile, the cage was unlocked. He was 60 years old, but he was free to travel again. He immediately embarked on a triumphant international tour, a grand resurrection of his global career. He was greeted in London, Moscow, and across Europe not as a controversial figure, but as a returning hero, a martyr who had survived the crucible of McCarthyism. The concert halls were sold out. The ovations were thunderous and emotional. It seemed, for a brief shining moment, as though the giant was back. but the long years of battle had taken a terrible and irreversible toll. The constant stress, the financial strain, the psychological weight of being a public enemy in his own country, the constant FBI surveillance, it had all worn him down, body and soul. His physical health, which had always been so robust, began to decline. And more tragically, he began to suffer from severe bouts of debilitating depression and paranoia. The unbreakable giant, the man who had faced down lynch mobs and congressional committees, was beginning to crumble from within. In 1961, while in his hotel room in Moscow, he experienced a profound mental breakdown. The circumstances surrounding this event remain shrouded in controversy and suspicion. He was found in his room, having apparently attempted suicide. He was hospitalized, and the incident was largely kept from the public. But for Robeson, it was the beginning of the end. There are still many of his supporters who believe that he was the victim of a covert intelligence operation, that he was targeted and drugged by the CIA in a final, insidious act of political warfare to neutralize him for good. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The man who had roared with such defiance was now trapped in a silent internal struggle he could not win. He returned to America, not as a triumphant artist, but as a patient. He spent the next several years in and out of hospitals and clinics, undergoing treatments, including electroshock therapy, that were often as brutal as the illness itself. The great fire that had burned so brightly, that had challenged an empire, was being extinguished by a quiet, internal darkness. In the mid-1960s, at the very height of the civil rights movement he had helped to inspire, Paul Robeson made a final, heartbreaking decision. He retired. Completely. He withdrew from public life, from the political battles he had waged for so long, from the stage that had been his pulpit. He moved into his sister's home in Philadelphia and spent the final decade of his life in a self-imposed, almost monastic silence. He issued no statements. He gave no interviews. The man who had been one of the most famous, most outspoken, and most articulate figures in the world chose to end his life in quiet obscurity. It was a profoundly tragic and poignant end to an epic life. While a new generation of activists, the children of his revolution, marched on Washington and fought for the very rights he had championed a generation earlier, the old warrior was silent. He had fought his battles too early, had been too far ahead of his time, and he had paid a terrible, personal price for his prophetic vision. When he died in 1976, his passing was noted, but the true, radical, and uncomfortable story of his life, the story of his war against America, was still largely a taboo subject. The process of forgetting, which the government had started in the 1950s, had been largely successful. The giant was gone, and for a time, it seemed as though his roar had faded into a whisper. But a legacy this monumental cannot be buried forever. The slow, quiet resurrection was about to begin.